Mr. William Binney, it's such an honor to have you here with us at the Herland Report. And you are a man of an impeccable record. You are a true American patriot. And we're so honored to have you here. You had 4 years at the Army Security Agency during the Vietnam War, prior to entering the National Security Agency, what is known to be the NSA, in 1970. And from then on, you rose to become a director and also the co-founder of the Research Center at the NSA headquarters in Maryland. And first and foremost, a month after 2001, you resigned from the NSA and became the original and first whistleblower, long before Edward Snowden or the others, as to something happening that wasn't correct.
Well, it was what they were doing was starting to violate our Constitution by basically initially spying on every U.S. citizen and every electronic transaction they made. Phone calls, emails, all of that. So that's what I objected to immediately, because it's a totalitarian process. I mean, that's historically what totalitarian states do. They try to know everything that their citizens are involved in, everything they're intending, so they want to know everything about them so they can, if there's a threat anywhere, they perceive a threat, they can attack that threat to stop it. So, and that's what they did here with some of our media, the reporters and so on. They would attack them, like Jim Risen and Jim Rosen, the Associated Press, those people were basically threatened with grand juries and indictments. And that's how they basically shut them down. But then when the knowledge of all this massive spying on U.S. citizens got around, all of their sources started drying up. No one would talk to them because they'd be afraid of being caught in the sweep of bulk acquisition. So that's why, for example, Deep Throat back in the Nixon days, even back then, had meetings in sub-basements in parking lots, so that there was no camera around, no people around, you know. They could see and they could be private. That's the only way to actually be private here in this country now, or anywhere in the world, really.
Investigative journalism and reporting used to be an objective reporting, or at least attempting to be objective in the outlook of news reporting, used to be such a building block and cornerstone in Western journalism. But while what we see today is that over 90% of the American media is owned by only 6 corporations, and most of them have a quite transnational, connections. So it's a complex situation where one gets the feeling that the media isn't exactly the media anymore.
No, in fact, they've been infiltrated by CIA and various other agencies, and they basically, when it comes to national security, they only talk about what the administration wants you to hear. And they basically suppress any other statements about anything that's going on that that the administration does not want public. So they basically are lapdogs for the government. I mean, Casey, who was the director of Central Intelligence Agency back when Reagan was president, he said at one point that you'll know how effective we are once at least 70% of what's publicly known is false. In other words, they've been infiltrating them for decades, and they're pushing their thinking and their statements and their agenda to the media, so the media will promulgate it to the public, so the public won't even have any idea what's going on. I mean, that's their whole objective, keep everybody uninformed so that they can't make a smart decision about anything that's being done. That everything is being done behind a secret door, and you're not supposed to know about it. So that's really destroying the fundamental essence of democracy and what that's supposed to mean in terms of having the people have knowledge about what the government's doing, and making smart decisions on how they vote, what they ask for. I mean, that's what our Constitution was all about. The people were supposed to know what the government's doing, not the government know what the people are doing.
And that's also the main principle with the French, we know it from the French philosopher Montesquieu as well, that the main principle for a democracy to function was that the judiciary, the executive branch, and the legislative branch is three separate powers. And he defined it in such a way that if those three are not separate anymore, but interdependent and intermingled, then you will have an autocratic, or you may say a totalitarian system.
Yeah, that's pretty much, I think, where we're headed. I mean, I think a lot of it's already there. A lot of the Congress has been read into this, and it gets back to how democracy here in this country was subverted. And it was basically done, I think, by Cheney. He masterminded this. Because he spent time in Congress, he knew about the congressional operation, how it worked. And of course, he was assistant to President Nixon back when he was spying on everybody too, that he thought was important for him to look at. So he knew that, and he knew that he needed to know things about people in the opposition. So what better way to do it than have an agency of the U.S. government just open up and collect everything, store it, so you can go in and look at it at any time, retroactively examine anybody. And so in order to do that, you see, he had to make sure that the Congress had limited knowledge of what was going on. So how did he do that? Well, he said, I'll pick the Gang of Four, which is the ranking member and chair of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Those four people were the first people briefed, I think, on the 4th of October of 2001, about not just NSA programs, but also CIA programs. So they bought into those programs. And once you did that, you co-opted in the leadership in the Congress. Okay, so now they have a vested interest in making sure you don't get discovered, right? Because if you're discovered, they also are exposed. So that's why, for example, that was the first briefer from the Senate, or the House, and the ranking member was Nancy Pelosi. Now, Nancy Pelosi is currently Speaker of the House. She was Speaker of the House back when they were talking about impeaching George Bush. And she, of course, as Speaker, she'd have to approve the motion on the floor. In other words, if she didn't approve it, it wouldn't go to the floor, and nobody could vote on it. Well, she said impeaching George Bush is off the table. So you're not going to do that. And the reason she said that was she was already culpable in these programs. So if you impeach George Bush, George would say, you have to impeach yourself there, Nancy, because you're involved in this. You agreed to these programs. See? So that got the Congress co-opted, and then they had to look at the judges and the courts. Well, they didn't want to go into the Article 3 courts because then it would be publicly exposed. So they had to go to the FISA court, which was a secret court. It's not an Article 3 court. I call it an Article 2 court because it's run by the administration. It operates, I think, on the 6th floor of the Department of Justice building, and only the government talks to them. So in other words, they only bring evidence from NSA or CIA or FBI to those people for a warrant. So they first co-opted in the leading judge on that court. So that was I can't remember her name, but she was in office in 2001 and 2. And when she was co-opted in, Hayden went over to her over the weekend and just kept hammering at her to do this. We have to do this for security. If we don't do it, another attack and 9/11, all those lies that he was telling her. I mean, we clearly could have stopped another 9/11. It's very simple to do it with a thin thread program, because it was pulling out the needles. Well, but he didn't tell her that. So, and he kept saying, you have to do this bulk acquisition where you'll never understand or never see the threat coming. Well, that was an obvious lie from the beginning, right? Because we'd already proven it that according to the testing we did inside NSA, or Tom Drake did inside NSA in early 2002, it was clear that they could have picked out not just that attack, but any attack in the world, right? In advance. I mean, it's not, you could see these things coming.
But isn't it conspicuous? I'm thinking about Thomas Drake and that discovery that they didn't report to the FBI. The discovery that there was some activity pertaining to these I mean, to what degree is it a coincidence that right before 9/11 the thin thread is scrapped? and one opens up for the full bulk.
You could even.
And to what? And is it a coincidence that the moment Thomas Drake discovers also that there was some information withheld from the NSA towards the FBI? Why was that withheld?
Well,
and when that is discovered, then FinThread is again shut down.
So because it was really making them look really bad. Yeah. Well, the point was that at the time, they didn't know they had it in their database. So, when FinThread ran, they found out they had information there that wasn't even known to the analysts at NSA. But that gets back to the reason we did FinThread, because they were buried in data and couldn't see the threat. That's what's true today, and that's true look at the French after the attack in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo attack.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Remember that? And they came out and said, we need another €1 billion, another 1,000 analysts, and more data. And they got all of that. And then 8 months later, they had another attack. And yet, in both cases, attacks were done by people that were known to be threats.
So that's been one of your arguments all the time with the Stellar Wind as well, that when you have such immense amounts of mass bulk information, it becomes so vast that you are clogging the system in such a way that you don't see the tree for the woods, to put it that way.
Well, I did an estimate, for all the agencies in the United States, all the Five Eyes agencies, and all the other agencies cooperating with them in 9 other countries. I reckon they had about 20,000 analysts looking at these kinds of problems off the internet data. So 20,000 analysts, and then I said, well, how many people are involved in the collection? Well, I'll say it's about a little over 4 billion. So you divide 20,000 into 4 billion, and you get 200,000 people. Each analyst has to look at 200,000 people. Now that's if they were uniquely dividing. Now they don't do that, of course. There's duplication, every country duplicates stuff, so it's even worse than that. And if you think about that, that's impossible to do that. No one could possibly do that. So that's why we were doing the FinThread program. We were automating the analysis process to be able to pick the needles out of the haystack and pick out anything that might be associated with them and needs to be looked at. But we didn't call them guilty to begin with. Now that's what happened after 9/11. They used the 2-degree principle. I left them, and they used it in the data they already had and did a sweep of that and found a couple thousand Muslims inside this country, in which the FBI immediately went out and basically arrested them, put them in jail, and then over a period of like 6 months or 8 months, they found out they weren't really terrorists after all, so they let them out of jail. But that's the consequence of incompetence and ineptitude, and also bulk collection and bulk attack and bulk everything. This is what the British, at least, are openly talking about in their investigative powers bill. I testified before the House of Lords there. The same as saying the same things, and still they're having the same problems. A couple more attacks in England there. So after that, people who were known, but they didn't follow them, they didn't stop them. So they're, I guess they have a philosophy that says, well, it's good for us to have information on everybody, so we'll have to tolerate the losses in the meantime to continue that process, because people die all the time, so what's a few more?
And
that's basically, I think, the philosophy they have. Otherwise, they do something to stop this.
That is the conspicuous part of it, is why nothing is done to stop it.
Right.
And why change from a system of bulk collection that actually works and that is constitutional and under US law and under international law, why change it to something that clearly violates the US Constitution? Who profits from that, and why implement a system that makes it harder to really get what you would say bad guys, because it's harder now to find the terrorists in that particular segment.
Well, that's if you have people look at it, right? If you have software do it, it's pretty simple. So that's how you can pull the needles out. But you don't want them, when they do searches, they do word searches. You put a word search or a phrase in, and then it'll give you a return of tens or hundreds of thousands of things, and you have to look at to try to find the thing you want. It might not be on page 1, it might be on page 1,000, you know? So you never get to it. So that was the process that was happening in the 90s. You know, the analysts couldn't get to the targets they needed to get to. So that's why we did the thin thread. How can you make this massive amount of data a manageable problem? Well, it was to use the metadata to select out and associate things and pull out by association. That way anybody who wasn't associated with these bad guys, you just could recognize that and just let them go right by. And you do that, you know, you don't have to collect anything. You could do that as you're monitoring the fiber lines. That's what we were doing.
And you're speaking about the destruction of the legal system, or the threats against the legal system in democracies due to this.
Yeah, because it violates everybody's rights. I mean, you can no longer have a private conversation. You can no longer have private email. It's your affairs and effects, and that's basically what under the Fourth Amendment of our Constitution is the privacy right of the citizens of the country. You know, it's a violation of their constitutional rights when you take that in. And it's the same with associations or a due process, or, you know, the right to not have you testify against yourself, which is effectively what they're doing when they take in everything you say and everything you write. That's effectively using your words against yourself.
So how is Facebook and Google and Twitter spilling into all of this?
They are a part of the what's called the PRISM program, which was one of the second thing that came out from the Edward Snowden material. Now, the PRISM program was set up to demonstrate or to allege, let's put it that way, that the government, the U.S. government, is abiding by the laws of the country. In other words, they'd have a warrant or a probable cause to go after somebody, and they would ask the companies to give them all the data on that person. Well, that was the upfront thing, you know, so that they could demonstrate to everybody it's really we're doing everything the proper way. But in the background, with the program called Muscular, they were tapping the lines, major trunk lines between the data centers of these companies, so that when they pass data every day, at the end of the day, they back the data up. They pass it all back and forth, so they back it up. So that meant from those taps, they got everything those companies had. So that was the background thing. That's on the upstream program. That's part of the upstream tapping programs. So, and those are the real programs that are collecting the bulk acquisition on the world. And, you know, by doing that, you know, they're violating, again, all the principles and amendments in our Constitution and general human rights for everybody, really.
And then, of course, we had the Mark Zuckerberg came out a couple years ago as well, that so many of these Facebook files ended up in the advertisement and the agencies and all over the place. So, yeah, it's really something for people to consider when they write things in social media nowadays.
See, that's the other aspect. See, these companies also, in another program, sell data to the government. So in other words, they'll go over and say, give us your collection or everything that ever been added to Facebook or whatever. Just send it to us and we'll store it and analyze it. So, and that's what the FBI says. You know, Facebook is one of their better sources to analyze for criminal activity. You know, because sometimes the criminals actually put the photos up of doing the crime. Mm-hmm. So that's really not too smart on their part. But, you know, I guess they like to think of themselves as being in a movie or something at that point, or I'm not sure. But, but the point is that they still, all these companies, by collecting this data, are feeding it to the government and getting paid to do that. So they pay them for so much data. So it's added to their bottom line as a profit without any effort on their part.
Jaron Lanier, one of the Silicon Valley IT gurus, has spoken about that recently, I do believe in a Channel 4 interview, at length, how these Facebook algorithms, and I mean how it really takes a control of a person's life, and the reduction of information in the sense, for example, the YouTube as well, I mean, once these algorithms starts moving, if you watch the video of Jordan Peterson, now all of a sudden all you're getting is Jordan Peterson. So there's it kind of restructures information in such a way that you do not get new information, but you only get endless repetition of the things you already know much about. And pertaining to Facebook, it's supposed to be just the place where you talk to your mother and your brother and your sister, so that you just don't enhance your competence in anything.
But I personally do not use Facebook. I don't do Twitter. I don't do any of that. I don't click like on anything. Because if you start to do that kind of activity, what happens is they're gathering that information, and now it begins to show a picture of what you think and how you think. And that's just the total occupation of the entire person. Once you know how they think and what they like and dislike and the feelings they have, you know, that really is a total violation of their character.
And it is a re-entry of a totalitarian way of controlling.
And you can envision from the future of the Internet of Things where they could use that in combination with that Internet of Things to predict in advance that you might be doing something nefarious or intending it, you know. And unless they have an algorithm that has a basis of validation and verification, which they don't, by the way, they don't. Why, everybody's in jeopardy. I mean, it's like, I can't remember the name of the movie where they had these people who were mentally perceiving others committing crimes in the future, and then they sent somebody out to stop them and arrest them before they committed the crime. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that can easily happen off this, you know, through algorithms.
But then again, didn't we see the Soviet Union fall? Didn't we see the end of a system and the end of socialism, really, and the end of that kind of thought control system that exists in states where everybody's employed by the government? At one point, do you foresee some sort of uprising or some sort of breakdown of this kind of Sovietization of America?
I call it fascism, yeah. Yeah. That's the path we are on. I mean, even an elderly couple in Germany approached Tom Drakeman in one of his visits there, and they told him, they said, you know, we are in a post-fascist state, and we know it, and you're in a pre-fascist state, and you don't know it. So, and all of the evidence is that's in fact the direction we're going. I mean, all these totalitarian processes were in all the fascist states. They were all the communist states, all of it. And they still are. In China to a degree, you know. In fact, China and Russia are trying to emulate what the U.S. is doing. We learned from them to do that through the Stasi. I mean, if you went to the Stasi Museum in Berlin, they have the stored racks of data, folders on everybody in the country. You know, handwritten notes and all. But so it was not very efficient. Okay, so it was hard to manage. Whereas now, NSA has it all electronically, and you know, they have the ability to manipulate it, not just know it, but change it. They can actually change what's in there, if you want to fabricate evidence against somebody, for example. Okay, so, and also CIA has, and it's been exposed in the Vault 7 stuff that CIA had the Marble framework program, where they could go in and attack a site and make it look like someone else did it, namely the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, you know, the Iranians. That was the whole idea. So they've got those programs to manipulate the data and make it look like somebody else did it. But you see, that's why I keep basically saying that the only way to really know who's attacking you is to actually have a trace of the packets leaving your site to where they go. That's the only way to do that. And there are programs that are easy to make that happen. Trace route programs. In fact, the NSA has hundreds of them embedded in the network to do exactly that, to trace the packets. That's one of the reasons I was saying that Russiagate here is the biggest farce going, because nobody said anything about where the packets went. And when it came to the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment by 3 agencies, and selected people in each of those three agencies, not the general analysts, right? They said, the CIA and FBI said, oh, we have high confidence that the Russians did it. And NSA said we only had moderate confidence. Now, what that means is they have no evidence whatsoever, right? Because if NSA had the evidence, they would know exactly where it went. There would be no question, this is it. You know, because about 5 years ago, something like that, the Chinese hacked pulled a hack in the US, and they traced it back to a building in Shanghai. And so it came from that building. That's a military building, so they hacked us, you know. That's the point. That's the whole idea. I mean, I got tens of thousands of implants around this network, tens of thousands. The Snowden material back in 2013 said they had over 50,000 total. But, I mean, and it's all over the world. So it's it's just, I could see that coming. That's part of why I objected to what they were doing. Because that kind of power people are not supposed to have that kind of power, because that destroys the entire integrity of any kind of democratic state. I mean, it undermines the entire legal system around the world, because all of this stuff that's being done in the U.S., it doesn't just stay here. I mean, it's being used through the MLAT, the Mutual Law Enforcement Act Treaty, to pass it to other countries in the world. I mean, any country that has relationships with the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, anywhere in the world to stop drugs or crime, they can get this data, but they won't be given the NSA data. They'll have to make up their own parallel construction, right? So it's subverting the judicial process, not just here, but around the world.
And it's worrying when we remember the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who so eloquently wrote her material post World War II, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She elaborated quite well on the difference between a totalitarian state and a dictatorship. A dictatorship being forcefully there with the military, you'll be shot if you say something. And people are completely quiet because they know they'll be shot. Yeah. Or prosecuted in some court of law. But you said the problem with the totalitarian state is that it enters every fabric of the human. Yeah. They want to know who you're married to, what your thoughts are, how you're raising your children, what you're watching on the television. I mean, the whole, what can you see, Aldous Huxleyization of the Western system, of what she feared so much.
Yeah. And it's actually a repetition of things like the Stasi did too. The Stasi had everybody spying on everybody else in the work environment. That's the program now in NSA internally. They say, see something, say something about your fellow workers or anybody that you're associated with in the agency. So I mean, that's kind of the same. That creates a very bad work environment, you know. And anybody that doesn't like somebody else can say something just to give them trouble, you know. So there's all kinds of, humans are really weak in my sense. They just do some crazy things like accusing others of doing things like the Russiagate, or other kinds of effects like some of the people are trying to make things up to go at the Make America Great kind of slogan that Trump is pushing. So they want to oppose that. So I think it gets back to, I think what we were talking about before was the world organization and a world setup and trying to convert to one world government, basically. And that means you have to know everything possible to be able to do that, because then you have power to make it happen. Without it, they don't.
And that's the paradox where the media, we've been discussing the media as well, but it really is a paradox to see how numbed down the American nation is, and much of the same goes for Europeans, also pertaining to the drug industry, because frankly it's interesting to see how when President Trump, in his address to the nation during the standoff with Congress, his speech was really a full frontal attack on the illicit drug industry coming into this nation from its southern borders. I think around $100 billion worth yearly. And the big surprise to me was to see the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, fighting so fervently for the continuation of illegal activity on so many levels.
And one of the facts I think that I don't remember them mentioning was that as a result of this drug influx through not just I mean the southern border is one of the main entry points, but the other entry points of entry like airports and so on, are also used. To what degree, I'm not sure in terms of percentages, but certainly I think 90% of the heroin comes through the southern border into the U.S. But the effect of that is overall, on an average, I think about 70,000 U.S. citizens die from this drug overdoses every year. I mean, that's every year. And if she doesn't think that's a crisis, I don't know what is a crisis. That alone is a crisis.
And considering, I do believe it is 27 million, something like that, Americans on illicit drugs.
Oh, yeah.
And according to the Mayo Clinic, 7 out of 10 Americans are on prescription drugs.
Yeah, that's another problem, yeah.
Both big pharma and illicit drugs coming into the United States. And one would assume that a Democrat, which is the party that one normally thinks would support the legal immigrant and the working class segment in society, those are the ones pushing for keeping the borders open, which they know only profits the very wealthy, because it's common knowledge that once the illegal aliens float into the United States, they do push the wage level down.
And they're abused in the process. Yeah.
Yes.
In many ways, but also many people forget. I'm old enough to remember. Back in the 50s and 60s in the South, we had the Jim Crow laws, for example. Those were run by Democrats in the states at the time. The southern states at that point were Democratic, not Republican. So when the Jim Crow laws were going out, the South turned Republican. So it was the Republicans, and Lincoln was a Republican, not a Democrat. So people don't remember these things, or the Democrats don't want them to remember, so they don't address them. They say, that's not us,
And
but it really is, and they came from that party. That's the party that did it.
Yes, and the KKK, I do believe, back in the day also were Democrats.
Yes.
And it was the Republicans that were against slavery, but it was the Democrats that actually voted for it or wanted to keep it back in the day.
Yeah.
People forget that too.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's selective memory that people when you're in power now, and if you have leverage over others like the media, you can make sure they don't say the wrong thing. Yes.
So here we are up against an American media outlet system that is largely owned by the transnational corporations here in the United States. And we have been hearing about a Russian collusion.
Well, okay, there were two things that came out basically to try to assert and prove that the Russians really hacked the Democratic National Committee, and got them and the Podesta emails and published them, gave them to WikiLeaks to publish. The whole procedure was pushed by the intelligence agency, the NSA, CIA, and FBI, as well as the DNI Clapper at the time, General Clapper. And also, I think the Democrats in general did it, and they did it through various other, they had the separate Steele dossier as a way of paying for that and trying to subvert the government here. But the main they were trying to pick an external threat. Now, the Russians have been in, from the Cold War, they're characterized as bad guys. Okay, so that characterization is what they played off on the public here, by saying they hacked, and it was just to divert everybody's attention from what was said in the emails that were being exposed by WikiLeaks. So if you devote their attention over here to saying, the Russians were hacking in and doing this is really bad for our republic and all that, and characterize them as more bad activities of more bad guys, then and also to associate it with President Trump and his campaign would be a way of justifying evidence as probable cause to impeach him. So they were trying to get everything done all at once, cover up what they're doing, and get rid of President Trump. But in the process, see, when you put data out for people to examine, that's very dangerous, because if you try to look legitimate and proving a point, that's really not that easy. Okay, you can make a lot of mistakes in that process, and you can be picked up for that. Well, that's in fact what happened with the Gusev 2 material, and also with the latest material that published, the DNC material itself that was published by WikiLeaks. So there were some technical facts in there that nobody really noticed, except for those of us who went through looking for things. And in the case of the Gusev 2 material, it was they put that material out on the web. It was like I don't know how many thousands of emails and files and so on. So when they did that, they also put out all the time stamping with it. So in other words, when you send things down a line, something goes across the line and there's a timestamp at the end that says this is when it went. This is the final, and the next file would go and the next timestamp. So that meant you could take the time between two timestamps, the volume of the data, and calculate the rate of transfer. Okay, so when you do that, you find that, gee, this stuff, the highest rate we got was 49.1 megabytes, not bits, bytes, per second. Now that we knew was kind of hard to get across the net, across the Atlantic, So we basically said you couldn't do that. And some of our people in the VIPs, the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which I'm a member, I try to stay sane at any rate, but some of our members said, oh yeah, you could do that. And so we said, okay, we're going to try it. So I had some hacker friends in Europe, traveling around in Europe. They're going to try and hack and pull the data across, see? So, and I had another friend over here put a gigabyte of data out there in a file and said, okay, there's the file, you can go see if you can pull it across. So we tried it from Belgrade and Albania and several places in the Netherlands and England. And the best we could do was 12 megabytes, 1/4 that rate, between two data centers now. This is not, human to human, this is a data center to data center, high-speed lines. 12 megabytes per second, which is 1/4 the capacity. Just if you're talking about the data, not counting all the overhead that goes with it to do the TCP/IP formats and all that, and all of the timing that goes with it to make sure things and data transferred properly and it's accounted for. So that was not possible for us to do that, and we said, so you see, we obviously assert that you can't do this, and we even said to those who are saying you could, okay, you need to demonstrate that you can, and we'll help you if you want to. I've got people over there who'll help you try to do it. How are we going to do this? I never heard back from them. And no one in the intelligence community has ever challenged that statement. So, and plus when we went on and looked a little further, Gusev 2 put out two sets of data, one dated the 5th of July and one dated in September 1st, I think it was. And if you looked at those two sets of data, you could take them like a deck of cards and merge them together like that without conflict. So that meant, if you looked only at minutes and seconds, if you looked at the hour and a date, sure, they're separate. But if you looked at minutes and seconds, they merge. So without overlapping. So that means Gusev 2 made one data pull, and he used some kind of algorithm. We have to look at the data to figure that out, but separated into two different sets. Claimed, and then did a range change on the date and a range change on the hour. And that's what he did. So that meant he was playing with the data. That meant this entire Gusev 2 thing is a fabrication that's provable by that merging. And not just that it wasn't a hack. It wasn't a hack because the speeds can't be accommodated by the network, and it's a fabrication because of the merger of the data. So the whole thing about Gusev 2 is a fabrication. Mueller has never called me to testify about that either. Now the president sent me to Pompeo when he was CIA director to talk to him about it, but Mueller, the House and Senate Intelligence Committee, House and Senate Judiciary Committees, all running these investigations, never called to talk to me or anybody in VIPs. Now the other issue came with the DNC material. That was published by WikiLeaks. Okay, so WikiLeaks has that. So we went in to look at that data. Some of people who were working with our group went in to look at it, and they found that, gee, there's timestamps here that, I mean, when you read something using a FAT format, file allocation table format, and read it into a storage device, which is what that FAT format does, it changes and rounds the timing on the last modified timestamp to an even number, to the nearest even number. And we looked at 500 files out of that, you know. All 500 were ending in even numbers with the file transfer time, last modified time. That meant, gee, let's figure, and I'm a mathematician, so I say, what is the random probability of that occurring? I said, well, any one of them has a chance of being even or odd, so that's one chance in two, right, of being even. So what's the probability of all 500 being even? Well, that's 1 in 2 to the 500th power. I translated it to decimal for people, roughly. It's 10, it also equals 10 to the 150th power. So that's like one chance out of 1 followed by 150 zeros. So it's pretty clearly some program went through doing that, and that's what the FAT file format does. So that implies that data set, the DNC emails that WikiLeaks published that everybody was objecting to, that they were claiming were hacked by the Russians, said that was read to a storage device, like a thumb drive. And that's why NSA didn't have it, because it was physically transported. That's why they couldn't do anything but say moderate confidence. That's only because they were told to say that. So that, in turn, suggests that someone had access to the data somewhere in the DNC network and downloaded that to a storage device.
So when we see the degree of deception and the degree of misinformation that we are currently living under, in the new West, the one world West, the not so democratic West any longer. What would be your advice? I mean, how would you restructure the system towards a greater respect for the Constitution and for democracy and civil liberties?
For me, technically, this would be a real simple thing to do. I would go through all of the, first of all, NSA is the big storage facility. But you could apply this to every country's storage. And I would go through and eliminate all of the data that wasn't relevant using the basic thin thread process, pulling out, immediately erasing it from their databases. Because once you take away the data, they no longer have it to use against you. So they cannot no longer abuse the information they have about anybody because they don't have it. So that was the whole idea behind the thin thread program, to keep that data out of there so nobody could abuse it. I mean, otherwise, I mean, you had cases like in NSA, a couple of years ago, they talked about a program they called love intelligence, love-int, meaning the NSA analysts were looking into the data to see if their lovers were cheating on them. So they would look into the phone calls and emails and what have you, and the translations of those phone calls too, by the way, to see if their lovers were cheating on them. And that's all local, right? That's a local call because their lovers are local, right? So it's basically local phone calls, not long distance. So it's not AT&T, it's Verizon or other companies that are giving them access so they can collect this data. And we had other testimony from other transcribers down in Fort Gordon, Georgia, where they were translating communication between U.S. citizens without warrants. That was David Falk and Adrian Kinney something. I can't remember her last name, but it's on the web also. Those were physically, they were working for the military at the time, but they were transcribing these phone calls at Fort Gordon, Georgia. And they had a couple, I think about 2,000 transcribers that are doing this. So, but that's all done. Now they do it all with or most of it they're doing with devices like, different translation devices that exist. I'm not sure they're using Google, but they're assuming something like an 80% accuracy rate on the translation. And if they get that level, you can run programs, algorithms through it to see if something reaches some threshold that you begin to say you have to set a threshold for it. But you can pick out words and phrases and things like that, and as you accumulate them, you can raise the threshold of interest in that conversation. And at some threshold, they'll cut it off and say, okay, we need to have a person look at this. So that's what the 2,000 people down in Fort Gordon would be doing. Now, otherwise, it'd be managed by machine and by software and done in the hundreds of millions. So, you know, that's the level of capacity of invasion of your privacy.
So how do you foresee the future?
Unless we stop this stuff, this bulk acquisition and bulk storage and retroactive analysis of it, we're doomed to be a totalitarian state.
And on that note, I would like to thank you, William Binney, the original and first whistleblower out of the NSA here in the United States, for taking the time to elaborate on your perspective here at the Herland Report. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.